it was Monday, the 8th of March, 1971, when Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier clashed at Madison Square Gardens in what was then dubbed the fight of the century. And I'm going to explain why it really deserved that moniker and why we really need to sort of remember it. And it's a good idea to reminisce about it. I say reminisce, obviously 50 years ago, I was 6 months old when this fight took place, so my recollections are a little bit hazy, but you know, it's been written about by so many people, from literary giants like George Plimpton, Norman Mailer, Bud Schulberg, who were all at ringside, you know, to all the boxing writers and scribes over the years. It's a kind of legendary event. So let's just recap how we got to that stage, how we got to that date. And what had happened is Muhammad Ali, or Cassius Clay as he then was, had won a gold medal at the 1960 Rome Olympics. They'd then gone straight into his pro career, you know, had a stellar pro career, run through the ranks. Then finally, in February the 25th, 1964, he met Sonny Liston for the heavyweight championship of the world. Now, Clay, as he was then, was an 8-1 underdog, but he beat Liston. You know, he outboxed him, outthought him, outfought him. Liston retired in the 8th round, or just before the 8th round. And Clay was champion. He announced his conversion to the Nation of Islam straight after the fight, and became Cassius X, and then became Muhammad Ali. So then he went on a run of defences. He was very, very busy. He just became better and better. I mean, remember, he was just turned 22 years old when he won the title in 1964. He looked absolutely peerless, you know, as he improved, as he went through these defences. But he had become extremely unpopular. Obviously, joining the Nation of Islam, they were seen as a separatist, you know, a racially separatist organisation. They were preaching essentially the same message as the Ku Klux Klan, that the races should be segregated and should live separately and should not intermarry. So he was seen as a sort of, you know, propagating hate speech at that time. So a very controversial figure. Then the Vietnam War came along. He was drafted to go into the military. He refused to go into the military on the grounds that he was a Muslim minister and a conscientious objector. So in 1967, his boxing license was revoked. His passport was taken away. He went into the system of fighting the draft, and there was no more Muhammad Ali boxing. He went around lecturing on campuses and say he was involved in a protracted legal fight with the US government. So and he couldn't box. So in the meantime, Joe Frazier had won in the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, had won the gold medal in the heavyweight division for America, and then was going through his pro career. And then Joe progressed and progressed and progressed, and gradually he beat Buster Mathis to win the New York state title, and then he beat Ali's boyhood friend and sparring partner Jimmy Ellis to win the WBA title in 1970, and so was seen as the best heavyweight out there by Ali, by a long chalk. He kind of cleaned up the division apart from Ali. Now, during his time of exile, Ali had been recognised still by the Ring magazine as the #1 heavyweight, you know, despite the fact that he was inactive due to being unable to get a licence. But the year before, in 1970, Ali, I think, was so much, you know, he was so tired of all this legal wrangling, said he wasn't going to box again. So at that point, even the Ring magazine said, we recognise Frazier as the undisputed champion. Then Ali was given his licence back later in 1970. He was still involved with this legal fight. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for dodging the draft, but he was out on appeal, and that was going to the Supreme Court. So he got his licence back in 1970. He had 2 warm-up fights, Jerry Quarry and Oscar Bonavena. He looked good in those fights, you know, both stoppage wins. And then he was pitched in with Frazier for this fight in 1971, as I say, March the 8th at Madison Square Gardens. And this was huge. For the first time ever, you had 2 heavyweights who had a legitimate claim to be heavyweight champion of the world. They were both undefeated. Frazier was 26-0, had beaten everybody that he could beat, everybody put in front of him. Ali was 31-0, you know, was obviously unbeaten, had beaten everybody that had been put in front of him, and they both could legitimately claim to be heavyweight champion of the world. You know, Frazier was recognised as such, as I say, by Ring magazine, by the WBA, by the New York State Athletic Commission. Ali had that thing that we now talk about, the lineal title. Lots of people said Ali cannot lose the title, you know, unless he loses it in the ring. So he's the legitimate champion. So these two came together for an amazing event in sports. Now, the thing about it as well is they represented 2 different parts of America. We think the divisions run deep today, but they ran almost even deeper then. I mean, you had a war raging in Vietnam, which at the time Ali said he wasn't going to go, was still, you know, the patriotic duty. It was quite a popular war, if I can actually use that phrase. But, you know, sentiment had turned against the war. It was seen as wasteful, and people couldn't see the point of it. You know, the body bags were coming home every day. And, you know, so public sentiment was largely against the war. And Ali seemed to symbolise that. He was a counterculture symbol. He'd been seen as also taking on the man, fighting the US government, you know, the biggest fight of his life. And he was still engaged in that fight. So there was a certain half of America, if you like, that was fully behind him, saw him as, you know, somebody who was unjustly stripped of his title, who was, you know, a martyr for the cause, who had been on the side of right in this fight, you know, against the Vietnam War, and now he was coming back and he was going to reclaim what was rightfully his. So people were passionately behind Ali. Frazier, on the other hand, was in a way the darling of the establishment. He was patriotic. He'd never put a foot wrong. And, you know, the other half of America wanted to see Ali beaten, and they were behind Frazier, a good, solid, blue-collar guy who'd paid his dues, come up the hard way, you know, done it all his way, beaten everybody put in front of him. And, you know, so lots of people were very, very behind Frazier. So it split the country down the middle. It split the world down the middle. And this is the amazing thing when you think about this fight. Ali had become such a cultural figure globally, you know, because of his embracement of Islam and everything else. I mean, we can say we all want to see Fury Joshua. We're all looking forward to it. But I tell you what, the people in China, the people in Africa, the people in the Philippines, they probably don't care that much who wins that fight. But this fight was global. Everybody cared about who won this fight. So we came to this evening, as I said, 8th of March, 1971, and the two fighters were in the arena. They weighed in. They both had New York NYPD bodyguards. Ali had 8 policemen assigned to him because of numerous death threats that he had received from sort of redneck people saying, you know, he's going to get shot on the night, he's going to get killed. And this has been a regular thing, you know, since he had taken this stance. But there were also death threats made against Frazier. So Frazier was under protection as well. So Ali decided to stay in the venue for the night. After the weigh-in, because the weigh-in was on the day in those days. Although obviously being heavyweights, it wasn't really, they didn't have to cut weight or anything. But also look at the weight, because that's going to become relevant to what happened in the fight. Ali weighed in at 215 pounds, Frazier weighed in at 205 pounds. So by today's standards, very light heavyweights, even though Ali was seen as a big heavyweight at the time. Frazier at 205 pounds was only 6 pounds over the current cruiserweight limit. You know, so a very small heavyweight. So after they weighed in, the crowd started to come. Now, this event, I mean, the centre of the world that night was in Madison Square Gardens. All eyes were on that event and on that fight. You know, it was said to be, it was like the golden ticket. It was like, you know, to get in was you know, to be seen. Half of Hollywood was there. I've already said, and this is the amazing thing about this fight, it was like, you know, the height of literature was there. Not only did you have 500 accredited people in the press seats, you had, you know, as I say, Bud Schulberg, Norman Mailer, George Plimpton, you know, the height of literature was there. It seemed to do this thing that only boxing can do and bring together the whole of society. Teddy Kennedy was there, you know, Senator Teddy Kennedy, Hubert Humphrey, the former vice president. So the world of politics was there. You know, the world of literature was there. The world of show business was out in force. I mean, half of Hollywood was there. Burt Lancaster was providing commentary for the fight along with Archie Moore. And, you know, Frank Sinatra had managed to get himself a press pass by going to Life magazine and saying, I will shoot the photos for you. So Frank Sinatra was a press photographer on the ring apron so that he could get even closer to the action. Barbra Streisand was there, Dustin Hoffman was there. I mean, you know, Burt Lancaster was there. The whole of Hollywood were there, you know, in force, in attendance. And then, of course, you had all other areas of society. You had mafia dons in there who had presumably made lots of people offers they couldn't refuse to get tickets. You know, you had the height of fashion. Everybody was being seen. You know, it was the most incredible venue to be in and to be seen at. The undercard was okay. The undercard was nothing to really write home about. Nobody was really interested in the undercard. Such was the magnitude of the main event. Interestingly enough, Rahman Ali, Ali's younger brother, did box in his 8th pro fight, and he lost to a British fighter. It was, you know, his first loss in those 8 fights. Maybe a bad omen for Ali, but anyway, Ali didn't come out to watch. It was the only time he didn't come out to watch his brother, because obviously if he'd gone ringside, he would have been absolutely mobbed. Interestingly enough, the biggest ovation, and the ringside announcer said, normally at these big fights, you introduce. If Frank Sinatra was there, they're going to say, Frank, come up and say hello to the people. You know, Dustin Hoffman's there and all these other people. The ring announcer said, I'm not going to introduce anyone tonight because everybody is here. So basically saying, I'll be here all night introducing everyone. So he didn't bother doing that, but there was an amazing ovation for Joe Louis. When Joe Louis came into the arena, went to take his seat, the whole place stood up and applauded until he sat down. So then the fight finally came about, and the tension was unbearable. When I say the tension was unbearable, you know, you think that's a figure of speech. 2 people died of heart attacks before the first, in the crowd, before the first bell had rung. That's how, you know, that was the tension in this arena. And as I said, it was a global event. Another remarkable thing when you talk about the press seats, the Russian news agency TASS. Now, professional boxing was banned in Russia. It was seen as a capitalist enterprise, and you know, so it was very much frowned upon in Russia. Professional boxing was banned. Even the Russian official news agency TASS sent 2 reporters to be ringside. Those reporters all wore red baseball caps, and they were given out to all the press corps. And a couple of the English reporters, being a bit stuffy, as we have that reputation for being, said, we don't want to wear baseball caps. We don't want to wear these garish red baseball caps. And John Cohen, who was the PR representative, said, you better wear them because there's 20,000 people in here. There were 20,455 people in the arena, a capacity sellout crowd. He said, there's 5,000 people outside trying to break the doors down. If those guys get in, the police are going to want to know which heads to hit and which heads not to hit. So I've told them, you've all got red baseball caps on, so you don't get hit. So if you don't want to wear it, it's up to you. Everybody wore their red baseball cap that night, as you can imagine. So the tension was unbearable. Coming up to the fight, the protagonist came in. How was this going to unfold? We don't know. Ali had always been said that Frazier was made for him. A short, slow heavyweight, as he said, plodding along. And, you know, this was the other thing about the fight. The animosity, which maybe on Ali's part was manufactured to sell tickets, and obviously, you know, he obviously did feel, you know, that he was, you know, unjustly stripped and all this sort of thing, and it was about coming back. I'm not saying revenge, but, you know, taking back what was rightfully his. He had taunted Frazier, and Frazier was no way as verbally verbose as Ali. He couldn't compete in that arena. You know, Ali would just tear him to shreds when they spoke, you know, and Ali would taunt him with quite personal taunts. He would say he was an Uncle Tom. And Ali tried to portray Frazier as a figurehead, a tool of the white establishment. You know, he called him Uncle Tom various times, you know, which was a huge insult to Frazier. And Frazier would often say, you know, in private talks, I'm blacker than this guy. You know, he couldn't understand why people would say Frazier was the white man's champion, you know, and Ali, who, you know, I mean, Frazier was from dirt poor, you know, southern states. I mean, a real hard upbringing. And he couldn't see how he could then be portrayed as this white man's champion, as this establishment champion. But that's how Ali portrayed him. And Frazier just couldn't seem to break out of this box. But as I say, he couldn't compete with Ali verbally. But in a boxing ring, he felt he could very much compete. So there's a lot of stored up animosity coming from Frazier there. But again, it was how would these two styles gel? You know, Ali with his speed and with his jab, with his height and with his reach and with his footwork. And Frazier with that just chugging forward, that head movement to evade those shots. You know, he didn't really throw a lot of straight shots, Frazier. You know, he came in and tried to get close to you and break you up with those hooks. So we were trying to understand how these styles would gel. So they came to the ring, and it was almost thought that with all this tension, all this build-up, all this global focus, you know, all this arguments, all these political ramifications around the fight. And interestingly enough, another little thing to mention is Ali, the pressure on Ali, he was still waiting for his Supreme Court verdict as to whether he would have to serve these 5 years in jail. Now, it was generally thought if he won this fight, he would become so big that it would be impossible for the US government to convict him and send him to jail as the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world who had come back and reclaimed his title. But if he lost, if he got destroyed by Frazier, you know, his stature would go down and they may be able to lock him away. So in a way, Ali was actually fighting for his very freedom on that night as well as all the representations that he carried with him. So like I say, the tension was huge. The guys came into the fight. And it was an amazing spectacle. It was almost, people said, there's no way the fight can live up to what we're expecting. But it did. It was 15 pulsating rounds of unrelenting action. The styles gelled perfectly. You know, Ali was moving around, obviously, with that rapier jab flicking out. Frazier was getting close, using that head movement, throwing the left hook. But they had to change styles within that. Ali had to stand square because he knew that he couldn't, you know, use those legs to get away from Frazier for the full 15 rounds. Interestingly enough, the rope-a-dope, which we always talk about as coming about in 1974 in the Rumble in the Jungle, was really first employed by Ali in that fight. He couldn't keep up the footwork and the movement and be on his toes for 15 rounds against the unrelenting Frazier. So he would go to the ropes and he would cover up on the ropes and take little breaks and let Frazier punch away and hoping that he would punch himself out. You know, and so the tactics in this fight were always changing. Although there was basically that, so Ali had to stand sometimes with Frazier and trade with Frazier and almost come into his area and say, look, give me some respect. I'm tough as well. And he had to use that chin, which almost hadn't been tested up to this point. Not at this level. And he did have a great chin. But as the fight unfolded, it was the matador and the bull. As the fight unfolded, Frazier just kind of had the edge of it. It was always competitive, but Frazier had the edge. Ali had a very torrid 11th round when Frazier connected multiple times on a jaw, and he did look like he was going to go down. He staggered into the ropes. He didn't go down, but he was ahead going into the later part of the fight. Frazier was ahead going into the later part of the fight. Ali was ahead in the earlier part, and Frazier, did start to wear him down. Ali wasn't so fast on his feet, and he was ahead going into the final part of the fight on all three scorecards. But there hadn't been a kind of definitive point of the fight. He hadn't. He'd stood and traded with Ali. They'd fought each other, but they hadn't been that definitive moment. And that definitive moment came in the 15th and final round, because they boxed 15 rounds in those days. And Frazier unleashed this absolutely hellacious left hook as Ali was going backwards with his chin in the air. He unleashed this left hook. He almost jumped off the floor. The left hook connected, and Ali went down. And it was kind of Frazier saying, "I've done to you what you can't do to me." Frazier wasn't really that interested in the scorecards. This was the moment that he said, I am the better fighter. I am superior. It was the getting out all that frustration about being unable to verbally compete with Ali. All that, that people saying to him, you're not the real champion. People saying you're the white man stooge. People, all this sort of stuff that weighed really heavily on Frazier. I mean, his kids would go to school and get taunted. That he was an Uncle Tom, that he was a gorilla, that all this sort of stuff that Ali said about him. And so that was the moment that he really let it all out and was like, have some of it back. And that was also the moment that, everybody was like, right, okay, Frazier's won. You could probably argue up to that point. It was an even fight. It was a close fight. You could make arguments about, Ali landing more punches or, whatever, whereas Frazier's punches were maybe heavier. But at that point, everybody said, right, Frazier has won that fight. It was an unbelievable event. It was an unbelievable fight. And the amazing thing about it, Peter, is when you look at the build-up, it wasn't going to be the best time they fought. I think the Thriller of Manila, the third meeting between them, was even superior. In terms of a boxing spectacle of speed, skill, athleticism. I don't think they were as good in the Thriller as they were that night. Because they were a bit older and they're taking a bit more punishment, but their skills or whatever had declined almost, not their athletic ability had declined kind of at the same rate, and they were still, to sort of butt heads. And obviously it did turn into a trilogy of fights, with Frazier winning that first one, Ali winning the second one on points, which wasn't nearly as exciting as the other two. And then obviously they saved the best till last with the Thriller of Manila. So unbelievably, the fight that we've talked about and outlined, it wasn't to be the best meeting between them. But it was a pivotal moment in sports. It was a pivotal moment in sports and politics. It was a pivotal moment in sports and literature. It was just an event, a happening, if I could use that word. It was the fight of the century, 50 years ago today, Monday the 8th of March, 1971. And here we are, Monday the 8th of March, 2021, still talking about it. Go back and watch it if you get the chance. Well, it's on YouTube. Go back and watch it. It's incredible. It's worthwhile. And just think about not only the amazing fight, but everything surrounding it. So it's worth commemorating today, Peter. So pleasure to talk about it as always.